You were part of this. I see what you've become.
I'm German. Hello, Michael. Sorry,
And yet,
thank you for helping me there. Yes, hello, welcome.
Yes, absolutely.
So there is, as you saw, food outside, and you should help yourselves if you haven't already. And there is the promise of more. So George is an associate professor in the philosophy department. Congratulations on, it is a fairly recent promotion. Congratulations. Dan Mafora is author of Capture in the Court, in Defense of Judges and the Constitution. He's a senior researcher at the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. He previously worked at the Constitutional Court and is a master's student at UCC. In what department?
private law.
Private law. Okay. Dan, George, over to you.
Thank you, Joe.
Well, thank you very much to CSSR for hosting us. And it's an interdisciplinary book, or it's a book with contributions from many disciplines. So it's great to be in an interdisciplinary centre to launch it. And thank you very much, Dan, for being here. Dan has written also an excellent book, which I highly recommend, called Capture in the Court, in Defence of Judges and the Constitution, as Jeremy probably said. And what I found when I read his book is that there is a convergence in your analysis, Dan, of the change in the type of scepticism about the South African Constitution which has been voiced. And there's a timeline, and there's also a change in an ideological shift, which is similar to what a lot of us have been analysing in the contributions to this book. So I'm going to ask you to say something about that shift in the critique of the Constitution to start us off in a moment. But let me just say what I've seen and what some of the contributors are seeing in this shift in the discourse about decolonisation first. Because with the idea of decolonisation of the mind, or intellectual decolonisation, it's not at all a new idea, a new thing. Since the 70s, perhaps the 60s with the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa, but certainly the 80s, people like Wiredu, Pauline Hountondji, in philosophy, the idea that there's a decolonisation which needs to take place in the epistemic sphere was very, very prominent. And what happened in the early 2010s was that there was a shift in the discourse which it was sometimes difficult to pick up on, because you had these decoloniality theorists like Walter Mignolo, then in Southern Africa, Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni from Zimbabwe, also very prominent in South Africa, who are saying, yeah, we're doing this thing, decoloniality, which is both incredibly new and it's also what everybody was doing all along. And so they say that Wiredu, Hountondji, they were actually doing this decoloniality thing. But when you look into it, that doesn't actually seem to be the case. And what the decoloniality theorists, and of course that's what's been very, very influential in South Africa in the last 5-10 years, are doing, it doesn't have very much in common with Wiredu Hountondji. Wiredu and Hountondji, they're people who say, when we talk about decolonising ideas, knowledge, concepts, values, we're not talking about getting rid of foreign ideas. And they're very, very clear that that's not how they see decolonisation. Rather, it's an undoing of the way in which power relations have distorted, created biases, created blind spots in the ideas which people teach, which people research, and so on. And so what needs to be done is to find places where prejudice has discarded an idea peremptorily, put that idea back on the table, compare it to what it was replaced with, and then say, okay, as Wiredu always says, on independent grounds, which one is preferable? It's not a question of getting rid of foreign things, it's about undoing the effects of power. Whereas with Walter Mignolo, Grosfoguel, Maldonado-Torres, these guys who came out of the dependency theory tradition in South America, what they did was they took the idea of delinking, this concept from dependency theory, you delink from the core of global capitalism, and they applied it to knowledge. So they said, we're going to delink not from the core of the global economy, but from Western epistemology. And with that move, delinking, of course, takes on a totally different meaning because it's no longer an economic thing. It's about getting rid of ideas which don't belong. And one asserts what I would call a moral geography of knowledge, meaning that there are certain ideas and values which belong in a particular place and others which don't. So, for example, Walter Mignolo talks about the Kantian legacy needing to be restricted to its quote-unquote proper localism. Where is its proper localism? Presumably somewhere nearer to Kaliningrad, formerly Königsberg, than we are now. But why should ideas have a proper localism at all? What is it about places, which means some ideas belong there, some don't? What is it about people or groups of people, which means some ideas belong with them, some ideas don't? That's the question which decoloniality theory, as opposed to those earlier schools of intellectual decolonization, raises, and I would suggest doesn't ever give a very convincing answer to. So that's the shift that I think in the humanities we've seen, certainly the last 5-10 years in South Africa. I think it also chimes with some shifts we've seen also in politics internationally, which we'll come to in a minute. But perhaps, Dan, let me ask you to talk about the shift in the critique of the Constitution that we've seen.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that's a helpful background to kind of explaining how the changes in the legal scholarship tracks that change as well. Because up until 2011, 2012, what we see in the scholarship is critiques of the Constitution that are kind of working in the tradition of the critical legal studies movement, questioning, our assumptions about law, about neutrality, about how judges decide cases and things like that. But also another kind of critique is the more materialist Marxist critique that comes from the ANC's Congress movement, the Communist Party tradition that kind of predated, was always skeptical of constitutions even before the 80s or the 90s when we get our constitution. And so one of the main writers, Tsepo Matlingozi, worked in the first few years on the limitations and the inadequacies of socio-economic rights and their utility in kind of improving the material lives of South Africans. But in around 2013, 2014, the shift happens, and we start seeing work that's coming out saying that this constitution is colonial, this constitution is foreign, it's an imposition on an African society. South Africa doesn't work because you have a constitution that is fundamentally Western and you can't make it work. And in that critique also is built in this idea or this questioning of the very idea of human rights, right? That are human rights just another tool of Western imperialism, Western hegemony? And is it time to start thinking about whether or not the language and the framework of rights is what we should be using to solve the problems that exist in our society? And at the same time, also they start questioning the idea of South Africa itself, the idea of South Africa as a political entity, right? The nation state, the very idea of a nation state. Can we actually have that? And you'll see in some of the literature that I survey in the book, when you do buy the book, you'll see this appeal to we need to restore what were indigenous sovereignties that were not restored at the end of colonialism, at the end of apartheid, and were instead replaced with this nation state that now is uneasy because the tensions that underlie the initial conflict have not been resolved. So I think it tracks quite well. And also, just to mention that this scholarship starts emerging around the time of Rose Must Fall, so it coincides with that moment, which is something to think about. But certainly, I think it was quite I suppose a very clean break between the critical legal studies people who are still within the mold of liberal constitutionalism and thinking about how to make liberal constitutional democracy work, whereas this new decolonial thinking completely, almost throws it out, the baby with the bathwater, as it were. Yeah.
And so this critique of constitutionalism within the ANC, am I right that a lot of it would be informed by Marxism?
Right.
And so that's again a parallel actually, because it's a movement from a Marxist economist-style critique based on the idea of people's power, which should not be constrained. Would that be fair?
Correct, yeah. So in the ANC, during the when they start thinking in the late 80s about what a South African constitution looks like after apartheid, there's a huge debate about whether or not they should adopt a liberal constitution in the style of, say, the US, which was their reference point at that time. And there's a very helpful exercise that's done by Justice Albie Sachs at the time, who was the legal advisor to the Constitution Committee of the ANC, and he sets out different kinds of constitutions and of constitutional systems, and they ultimately settle on this liberal constitution with some very distinctive features, like the fact that there are social and economic rights, something that had never been done before, but something that the ANC felt very strongly that they should include to bind South African governments in perpetuity, right? As setting them apart from Western ideas of constitutionalism. And we also see it in how the language of rights, like the right to equality, explicitly says you can positively discriminate, right? The right to property isn't actually a right to property. It just says you can't be deprived of property. So there's this interesting debate that's going on that produces this unique document, but ultimately that Marxist school within the ANC is defeated, right? And what comes out is the constitution that we have now. But what the decolonial folk have done is pick up on the grievances of that split between the ANC and the PAC in 1955, and kind of retroject into that split their current ideas about what is truly African, what an African constitution looks like, and why this constitution is not an African constitution. Right.
And so that's within the ANC, and I suppose we should come on to in a moment, because these new ideas, these decolonial ideas, indigenous versus foreign in the sphere of knowledge, they've been looking for a political home, one senses, in the last few years in terms of practical politics. Beginning of 2022, Lindiwe Sisulu published an article criticising judges, in fact, very much along these lines, that they had been confused by foreign ideas. Then Floyd Shivambu within the EFF, he was often writing about the decolonisation idea in knowledge. But I think perhaps in the last year, we've seen another party which has taken on the mantle of the decolonial. But so let me ask you to say something about that in a minute, maybe. But so that's the shape of the of what's happened. And I think there are some very concerning aspects of it, to my mind at least. And one way of bringing that out is to look at Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni's work, because he began as a historian of Zimbabwe, and he critiques ZANU-PF in the late 20th century, lamenting ZANU-PF's reduction of politics to a polarization of patriots and sellouts. But what's ironic about that is that Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni himself, in the sphere of the politics of knowledge, he exactly does criticize sellouts compared to patriots. So, for example, of Samir Amin, he writes, this is a quote, emphasis on rationality is in itself a reflection of the extent of how interpolated by Western epistemologies some of Amin's articulations are. Quite a classic type of criticism. He calls Olufemi Taiwo, a Nigerian advocate of liberal democracy, enchanted by Euro-modernity. And the criticism here is not saying that the ideas aren't true, they aren't correct, because Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni thinks we're all born into valid and legitimate knowledge systems, as he always puts it. And it's also not a criticism of the Europeanness or the Westernness of the ideas, because it's okay for Westerners or Europeans to have those ideas. Rather, what he's criticizing is somebody for having that idea in the wrong part of the world. or for having that idea where they're born into a different knowledge system. And that's how rigidly connected in the decoloniality school identity and knowledge, or what's a correct idea to have become. So that's why I entitled our conversation From Politics and Knowledge to Politics, because I think that raises the question, what kind of practical politics would that give sustenance to? Or what kind of practical politics would you say, Dan, it is giving sustenance to now?
So it's a very difficult thing to it's a very difficult question to answer, because one of my critiques of the decolonial school in South Africa, at least in the legal space, is that they don't have an idea of what a decolonized constitution looks like. And when you press them on that, they simply retreat and say, look, that's not the work that I'm doing. My job is to critique. It's not my job to come up with what, it's my job to point out the problems, as it were. But I think the rise of the MK, I think, was inevitable, because the seeds of this anti-constitutionalism had been planted. But I think that it's difficult for the scholars to align themselves with the MK because of, one, who the party leader is, and two, the kind of rhetoric that they espouse, right? So there's come a time now where they have to reckon with the material effect, the real life effect of their scholarship, right? And they get quite offended when you say the MK party seems like the right home for you and your thinking. Let me just pull up some quotes from their manifesto. South Africa is dominated culturally, spiritually, and economically by a minority group with an alien culture. African cultural and moral values are undermined by a significant share of the population who prefer dominant Western views. Just give me a second. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa is colonial, founded on Roman Dutch law with very little influence of African jurisprudence. African traditional leadership is de facto treated as auxiliary with no role in the development of law and policies or participation in state administration. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that you read in some of these journal articles. But there's the cognitive dissonance between themselves, who see themselves as progressive, radical, and this conservative right-wing party that is saying the exact same things, right? And so that tension, I think, will be quite interesting to observe, whether or not it changes the direction of the scholarship, or if they actually do go forward and embrace it fully. But I do think that it is worth noting that this party comes up with this kind of rhetoric at a time where critique, like anti-constitutionalism, is at its highest. And I think they shouldn't be able to shy away from that.
So I sense that Jeremy is itching to call time on us. So let me just say that, so a lot of the contributions in this volume, Intellectual Decolonisation, Critical Perspectives, they're making the point that if one rejects that kind of, I would say, ethnonationalist kind of politics of knowledge, one is not throwing out the idea of intellectual decolonisation, the decolonisation of the mind. Because, I mentioned some earlier precedents, Wiredu, Hountondji, who precisely criticises what he calls the myth of primitive unanimity, the idea that everybody in a particular region or from a particular group must think the same way.
Yeah,
right? So those are other, the question is not really whether one should address how power relations have distorted ideas or not. Of course one should. The question is how.
Right.
It's not an either or, it's a which version of intellectual decolonisation do we want to pursue.
Right.
And so if we were to abandon this version, there are other versions which don't reject universalism, which don't say that one must stay with the ideas which one was quote unquote born with, as Ndlovu-Gatsheni would say. And so many of the contributors, including some of the people we're going to hear from in just a minute, make that very clear, that to reject the decoloniality school is not to reject intellectual decolonisation.
Absolutely, and I think what I was going to say earlier is that the decolonisation, decolonial scholarship never adopted Wiredu's kind of thinking, interestingly. So they jumped from the CLS kind of critical scholarship straight into decoloniality, and there wasn't that grappling with what ideas are useful, what ideas are good, but simply a focus on where do these ideas come from, right? So Western ideas are bad because they're Western, African ideas are good because they're African. Surely that can't be true. But that's exactly the argument that is being made, that one of the critiques is, well, even those black lawyers who are writing the Atlantic Charter in the ANC were also colonized because they were taught in London, right? So even the products of their own thinking is Western and not autochthonous and whatever else. And I don't think that's any way to deal in ideas.
So one of the curses of being a timekeeper is that you have to interrupt the discussion just when it's getting really interesting. But I think some of these issues which we're going to come back to in a moment. We're going to, we weren't here before, we're going to hear from some of the other contributors to the volume, and then there will be an extended period of time for discussion or questions or argument or engagement after that.